We're going to be sharing an exciting news with you before the next panel.
Good morning again. I am Lourdes Gobea, Director of OLLAS, and it is my pleasure to introduce my really good friend, colleague, and partner in good things across the borders. Luin Goldring, who teaches sociology at the University or at York University in Toronto, and who is going to preside over a very important ceremony about the International Network of Development and Migration and Development. Thank you.
Buenos días, buenas tardes, días todavía. Hi, everybody. It's my real pleasure and honor to be able to do this. As Lourdes has said, I get the honor of sort of formally launching the Omaha OLLAS node of the International Network on Migration and Development. And this is a really nice moment for us. I'm also going to abuse of my 5 minutes here to give you a little bit of background on the network and to talk about why this is such a great fit and such a great moment. So the Red Internacional de Migración y Desarrollo, the International Network on Migration and Development, was founded by Raúl Delgado-Wise, who is right here, and a few other colleagues from Zacatecas, and a few of us who were in Mexico at a time in 2002, and with support from the Ford Foundation. And this network had a vision, a mission that involved bringing together colleagues who studied migration, not just in Mexico City, but outside of Mexico City, to bring together a younger group of scholars who hadn't necessarily been sort of at the center of things, small center of things for a while, and to also make migration studies, migration-related research, something that would involve people inside and outside of academia, that would also include migrants and migrant-led organizations. Now, this may seem very normal right now, but somehow in 2002, it wasn't quite the norm. So this was part of what was going to be the new and different thing about the Network on Migration and Development. Another thing was that it was intended to really bring a much more critical voice to research on migration and development. Some of you may remember that a lot of people were very excited about remittances and all the wonders that remittances were going to accomplish, not quite sure for whom. But this critical perspective is something that Raúl has really pushed and others have really pushed, and really questioning the directionality between migration and development. Does one lead to the other? Which way do the arrows go, and so forth? And as we went forward, the idea was, and we now have, a journal, Migración y Desarrollo. That's been one of the platforms for accomplishing this dialogue, for disseminating this research. There have also been a number of international colloquia, training workshops that have really brought together students, faculty, people in NGOs, people in organizations. So I'd say the Red has been pretty successful on a number of fronts. And now we're at a junction, and I keep saying we, although I'm not really on the board anymore, but I was involved at one point. Now Juan Artola is leading together with Raúl Delgado, and we're at a juncture where the network has a restructuring, a bit of a new structure, and we're trying to generate nodes, and it makes perfect sense for OLLAS and Omaha to be a key node in the North American part of this international network. Because let me tell you that when Lourdes joined the board of the network, this was, a whole new, first of all, she brought her voice, literally, and also in song. And she brought her energy and she brought her networks. And as I had said at one point in one of our earlier meetings, the point of the red, the point of the network is really to be a network of networks. And with Lourdes, we have this dynamic node and another part of a network of networks. We have collaboration and contact with people in Ghana, in Spain, in the Philippines, in Rome, I'm sure I'm leaving in Argentina, in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Costa Rica, in a number of places. And I'm sort of a bit of a Canadian outpost, but sort of Canadian and sort of outpost. But this has really become an international network. At this point, we're in a place where we're restructuring a little bit. The network is restructuring. We have this wonderful opportunity with Omaha and OLLAS. And it's really an invitation to everybody here and to your networks to say, let's make this node and make this network whatever it is that you want it to be. The kind of core mission and vision elements, I think, there's a perfect overlap. There's a perfect fit between what OLLAS has been doing and building and what the network has been doing and hopes to continue doing in terms of public engagement, in terms of critically engaged research, in terms of developing and strengthening and maintaining ties among a number of partners in and out of academia and so forth, right? So there's a lot of overlap, so it makes perfect sense. But I think the membership or the inclusion of OLLAS and Omaha, UNO, in the network also highlights some of the challenges that I hope everybody here can think about a little bit. And some of those challenges involve how to do locally engaged relevant work that's also transnational, that's also multi-local, that also speaks to people living and working in other places. Now, we all have our transnational family collaborations and networks, but making this a more institutionalized process is a bit of a challenge. If you're working hard to maintain and develop networks with local partners, sometimes it's hard to scale that or to make that really work in other places. We don't always have a lot of time and energy. So that's one question, but I hope it's one question that people here will provide some feedback, will help to think about, really. Meterle coco so that we can think about how to address some of these challenges, right? There's also a question of support and how to maintain these kinds of institutional collaborations when the day is never long enough and we're all running around doing 10,000 things. But Juan Artola is going to speak to some of these questions of the future. I think it's clear from the presentations, from the work we've seen about OLLAS, that the agenda is very similar, and so it's a great fit, and I really want to emphasize that. And I'm very enthusiastic and happy that this is a node of the network, and I think it's been a great 10 years, and we will see what the future of OLLAS brings. It's also been a great 10 plus years for the network, and we'll see what that future brings. And this is a moment of institutional beginnings. So thank you.
Thank you, Luin. My name is Emiliano Lerda. Buenos días. Casi dije buenas tardes. Buenos días. Mi nombre es Emiliano Lerda. I am the Executive Director of Justice for Our Neighbors of Nebraska, and I also have the pleasure and the privilege of teaching a class here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha on immigration law and Latinos. This panel is it's truly an honor, and I mean that. It's an honor for me to be here and be a facilitator for this panel because in my work, we provide immigration legal services, education, and advocacy for low-income immigrants. And one of the things that we we see every day is the effects of these conflicting policies regarding migration or immigration policies in the country. And as we embark in this discussion of how do we fix the system or what do we need to do to fix it, it is extremely important to have conversations to better understand the root causes of the problems that we see today. And so it is that opportunity that OLLAS provided us to be here today celebrating the 10th year anniversary that I'm very grateful for. And I hope you join me in that feeling. And I also ask you to be an active participant in this conversation that we are going to have today. As you learn from our presenters, I ask you to share that knowledge with the community, because that's where we can start the change that we need in public perception. As my dad always used to tell me, and for those of you that know me, know that the story, I used to go camping with my dad in Argentina, and one of the things that he always did at the end is pick up things and fix things, and I was wondering, why is he doing all that? I mean, we're about to leave, and that whole simple thing that he taught me about leaving the campground better than you found it, I mean, it's just so simple. How are we going to use this information that we're going to receive today to do our part to make the campground better than we found it? So it is a great honor and privilege to introduce to you our three panelists today. Juan Artola, he is the former regional director for Latin America of the International Organization of Migration and the new executive director of the International Network of Migration and Development. And he currently works in Argentina, I believe, and so he's from Uruguay originally. Raúl Delgado-Wise, he is the president of the International Network on Migration and Development in Zacatecas, Mexico, and Leisy Abrego, assistant professor of the César Chávez Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies at the University of California at Los Angeles. So, without taking any more of your time, there are a lot of great questions that we're going to be asking ourselves during this panel. What does immigration from Latin America look like today? We're going to take a trip. We're going to be exploring these root causes and understanding the migration patterns in South America and then within South America, but then also how they impact the United States. I'm very privileged and I'm very thankful to give the podium to Juan Artola. I do have, there's a 15-minute time limit, and I do have cards and I'm not afraid to use them.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm quite glad to be here for my first time in the Great Plains. This presentation is part of what Lourdes this morning said about OLLAS and exchanging information analysis about other realities, and it's also part of what the International Network on Migration and Development wants to do, is to interact among a series of networks and know how to react to different realities in a changing world, a world that has changed a lot in the last 10 years, and particularly the migration world. We don't know if, or we cannot be certain if the world has changed for better or for worse, but certainly there are changes that we must need to assess and react to. The presenter gave me a great task, and I don't think I will be able to fulfill it because he expects me to talk in 15 minutes about the realities of migration in Latin America, and I will just stick to presenting what I perceive to be new approaches or new challenges of migration policies in South America. In the last decade, there have been important changes and new approaches to migration policies in South America, which I summarize as developing a positive view of migration versus migration considered as a problem or as a threat, as it is presently in North America and in large parts of Europe and the world. It's also an understanding that mobility is to be carried out within ongoing regional integration processes, and the two main ones in South America, or the two only ones so far, because there are more political integration regimes, are the Mercosur, or the Southern Common Market, and the Andean Community, or CAN. That migration must, and in general movement among countries must be facilitated instead of putting an effort and an emphasis on control. And that facilitation of intra-regional movement must be aided by regularization of migrants. And that migrants are persons with rights, with a variety of rights, labor, individual, social, cultural rights that have to be protected by the state. So this is translated, or was progressively translated in the last decade in a series of changes. Migration is perceived more clearly as a social process which requires to be addressed by public policies at national and regional level. That, as I said, intra-regional mobility must be facilitated, and tools for doing so have to be found. That migrant regularization has to be promoted by the states, as well as recognizing the importance of migrant rights as a key element in the definition and implementation of policies. That the social integration of migrants has to be addressed at all levels, beginning by the state, but also involucrating other levels of society, particularly social society. That nationals living abroad, of which there are quite a lot coming from South America, had to be somehow linked or relinked to their national realities, and that return, especially after the large crisis initiated in 2008, has been supported directly by policies and by state mechanisms. In the Southern Common Market, or Mercosur, there are a lot of decisions and agreements that address migration, but I will try to present and summarize the main ones. Some are very old. That's the Multilateral Agreement on Social Security, which dates in 1997, and the Social Laboral Declaration of 1998, which have been taking its time in being implemented. Actually, the Agreement on Social Security is only partially implemented in most of the countries, more than 15 years after becoming a regional agreement. There is an agreement on residence for nationals of member countries adopted in 2002 and signed by the presidents in 2003, which I will refer a bit more just right now. An agreement of liberalization of trade in services signed in 2003, and a declaration of migratory principles. I want to talk more about the agreement on residence. The agreement of residence, well, as you may know, Mercosur was originally composed by Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And a year ago, Venezuela joined Mercosur. And this agreement establishes basically that nationals of any member country, I take for granted that this is moving, yes. That nationals of any member country can live in one of the other member countries, just proving their nationality with a minimum of requirements. So any national of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay and Paraguay originally, with a minimum requirements, can establish himself or herself, or the whole family, in fact, because the agreement covers all the family, in any of the other countries, be granted temporary residence for 2 years, and then acquiring almost automatically a permanent residence after those 2 years. The agreement gives them the same rights as nationals, And in the last years, the agreement was also, well, when it was signed in 2002, the agreement included the 4 countries and then also Chile and Bolivia. In fact, Chile never fully entered into it because the National Congress never ratified it, and apparently there was not much interest in doing so. But then, after the 4 plus Chile and Bolivia, Chile formally, in the last 2 years, the agreement on precedence was also signed by Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. So this means that, in theory at least, because as we will see later, all agreements, one thing is the agreement and the other thing is the practice, all members, all nationals of 10 South American countries can live in any other country just presenting a proof of nationality. On the side of the Andean community, Andean community has signed also in the latest 90s and early 20s an Andean instrument of labor mobility to allow labor migrants move in the countries members of the community. The original Andean community was composed by Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. Venezuela broke with the Andean community because of Chile's presence after the dictatorship that we're talking about 40 years ago, and has never re-entered the community. And Chile, with the dictatorship, precisely left the Andean community. So the present Andean community is composed by 4 countries, which are Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. And these 4 countries signed these 2 very important, what they call it instruments, because it's a kind of legal name that internal agreements have in the community, but it's in fact has the status of an agreement between states. These 2 important agreements, the Andean Instrument of Labor Mobility and the Andean Instrument of Social Security. It has also been established an Andean Migration Forum, which is a permanent forum of exchange and cooperation between the Andean countries, including not only the governments, but also civil society organizations. And the Andean community signed 2 years ago an Andean Plan of Human Development of Migration, which has not been ratified by all members, but is gradually being implemented by most of them. There is also a mechanism in South America on regional dialogue on migration, which is the South American Conference on Migration, created in 1999 by all 12 South American countries, which means all the Spanish-speaking countries, Brazil, and Guyana and Suriname, although these 2 countries they not participate that actively. The main emphasis of this South American Conference on Migration was put on rights and on the linkage between migration, mobility, and regional integration. In 2010, the South American Conference approved a South American Plan for Human Development and Migration, which has a number of chapters, mainly related to modernizing regulations, institutional strengthening, and strengthening of capacities, more collaboration or strengthened collaboration with civil society organizations, and strengthening migration information. The practical impacts of this new vision and these decisions taken at Mercosur and CAN levels have been noticed in most of the countries in different ways, and are the ones I try to present here. There have been in most countries either new legislation or even new regulations regarding migration, generally with a more positive, open, and rights-protecting vision. Brazil right now is one of the last countries in beginning to discuss a new legislation. Chile is presently discussing a new law, and all the other countries, well, and Ecuador is doing the same thing, and all the other countries have, in the last 5 or 10 years, approved new legislation. Administrative and policy mechanisms for migrant regularization are in place in most countries. And this means that the irregular migrants can find a way to regularize their stay in those countries. Another impact is that slowly these new legislation regulations try to impose or made effective that all have the same rights, that migrants or immigrants and nationals have the same rights and access to the same services, and also that social and cultural integration of immigrants is being promoted by the states. Okay. As a tentative move, there is this migration, this new migration approach works towards a complementary labor market. I mean, trying to complement labor needs and labor movements in one country with the others. Pending and missing aspects in South America. I'm just trying to mention the main ones, but there are surely a lot more. And the first one is trying to translate agreements and legislation into practice, because sometimes it's already very difficult to get into an agreement or to build up a new migration policy or even to adopt a new legislation, but then putting it into practice is not that easy. And it's an area where social organizations and civil society organizations have quite a lot to play. There is a question of what I mentioned here, states and rights, and we must recognize that many countries are more prepared and more interested to defend and protect the human rights of their immigrants than of the immigrants in their own country. So they look more toward their people abroad than to the people they already have living inside. The quality of integration of immigrants is still has still a lot of problems to solve, and abuses and discriminations persist. There's a whole question of social security, which is a very important one when you get people moving from one country to the other, and how to preserve what they have worked and what they have contributed to social security. And then there is still a large work to do in the area of skilled migration and students. I would like to say, and I'm quite right in the time, I think, that more recently there is a huge question of citizenship and identity being discussed increasingly in all countries, because Mercosur talks about Mercosur, southern nationality or citizenship more than nationality. And the Andean zone also talks about Andean citizenship, and then new bodies like CELAC, the Latin American and Caribbean States organization, which excludes its all Latin America and the Caribbean, and excludes only the US and Canada. And also UNASUR, the National Southern Union, which gathers all South American countries. These are political bodies recently created, but have on top of the agenda the issue of identity and the issue of citizenship. UNASUR, in the voices of the presidents, has already declared that one of the main paths towards South American identity is migration, and therefore is discussing actively how to work with the migration issues in order to have them contribute to a South American identity. And I think this is a very important part, which of course won't be solved in the next year or so, but is in the agenda of South America, and in itself shows many of the quite relevant changes that have taken place in that part of the continent. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Juan. Now it's my privilege to introduce to you Raúl Delgado-Wise.
Well, I want to thank my friend and colleague, Lourdes Gobella, for inviting me to this new edition of Cumbre. I have had the privilege of participating, I think, in most of the previous Cumbres. I want to congratulate her and OLLAS team for their 10th anniversary. And this anniversary, as Luin mentioned, also coincides with the celebration of the 10th plus anniversary of the International Network of Migration and Development, and the launching, which is very, very important for us, of the North American node based in OLLAS. The purpose of my presentation will be to unravel some critical, some fundamental, and quite astonishing feature of the restructuring of innovation systems under neoliberal globalization, focusing on the US. And from this lens, I will try to address several key issues of the new role played by high-skilled migration, and more broadly, the exportation of brain force from peripheral to developed countries. My presentation will focus on Mexico. My presentation will be divided in 3 parts. I will first present some fundamental data regarding the dimensions and characteristics of Mexican highly skilled diaspora. Secondly, I will introduce 5 dimensions regarding the main characteristics of the restructuring of innovation systems under neoliberal globalization and its relationship with high-skilled migration. My analysis questions the assumptions underlying the optimistic perspective that envisions a transition from brain drain to brain circulation leading to brain gain for the main brain force exporting peripheral countries. And I will end up my presentation with a few concluding remarks. The following data can give you an idea of the dimensions of what I'm talking about. Mexican high-skilled migration more than double between 2000 and 2012. The dimension of highly skilled population of Mexican origin in the US, according to 2012 official figures, is truly impressive. 3.6 million, including 1.1 million born in Mexico and 2.5 million of Mexican origin born in the US. Mexico stands as the first high-skilled immigration country in Latin America and the 7th in the world. In addition, it is estimated that 60,000 Mexican high-skilled, there are 60,000 Mexican high-skilled temporary migrants in the US. In this slide, you can appreciate the importance of Mexican brain power for the US, which, as I will argue, relies more and more on foreign high-skilled immigrants. Mexico actually stands just behind India. And I think it's important also to notice in this slide that the 5 top countries providing the US with high-skilled immigrants are from emerging or peripheral countries or from the global south, if you wish. To give a rough idea of the significance for Mexico. In this slide, you can see that the graduate degree holders in science and engineering in the US are equivalent to the graduate degree holders living in Mexico in systems and informatics. Nearly 70% of the graduate degree holders in science and around half of the engineers with a graduate degree in Mexico. The new context portrayed by globalization entails a profound global restructuring of innovation systems led by the US, with the large multinational corporations operating as central agents. There are 5 dimensions of this process that are crucial for disentangling the true nature of this process and its implications for Mexico. First, the increasing internationalization and fragmentation of research and development activities. This has also been referred in the literature as open innovation, ecosystems or networks of innovations. Second, the establishment of scientific cities, like you all know, I think, Silicon Valley and the Route 128 in the US, or the new Silicon Valleys spread all over the world in peripheral or emerging regions, mainly in Asia, where collective synergies are stimulated in order to accelerate innovation under overt or covert corporate control strategies. Third, the establishment of new modalities of control of research agendas and the appropriation of scientific and technological products. I refer to patents, basically patents, by the large multinational corporations through what has been labeled as strategic investment. According to the RAND corporations, in recent years, 1 of every 2 patents in the US had a foreign inventor, and 75 of the patents in the universities the university had a foreign inventor. However, 93% of these patents were granted to multinational corporations. Fourth, the expansion in the south-north horizon of highly qualified human resources in science and engineering. I can give an example. For instance, China is producing 25% more than the US of scientists in science and engineering. Fifth, the increasing recruitment of highly skilled peripheral brain force via outsourcing and offshoring. In Mexico, the national innovation system was very, very weak. But it has been, in the last few decades, totally dismantled, to the point that Mexico has become one of the most dependent countries on patents in the world, as shown in this slide. Academic and political discussions on high-skill migration have abandoned the concept of brain drain to replace it with the notion of brain circulation. So this shift, the pessimism and concern regarding the emigration of skilled workers from developing to the developed nations have been turned into real optimism, rampant optimism, replacing the notion of loss with one of gain. This shift assumes that knowledge is a matter of mutual benefit and that contact and interaction with highly qualified foreign nationals will foster development in the country of origin, regardless of whom and where skilled migrants work and what they produce. Knowledge and research agendas are seen as neutral, as is intellectual property. That is the appropriation of the products of scientific and technological work, which is underestimated or simply ignored. Moreover, the euphoria around brain circulation and the establishment or rapprochement programs with qualified diasporas assume that innovation creates its own linkages with the productive, commercial, and services sectors through the process of incubation. Clearly, none of the referred assumptions regarding brain circulation hold or can be sustained. On the one hand, a growing number of brain force from the South is working in other countries, and the other, there is an increasing number of research and development platforms, what I regard as scientific maquiladoras, in peripheral countries associated to innovation activities promoted and controlled by the large multinational corporations. By expanding the mass of scientific and technological workers at their service, large multinational corporations not only accelerate and lower the cost of innovation, but also reinforce their monopoly power and control. And I will put, I think I'm going to save some time. I have my concluding remarks. The restructuring of innovation systems under neoliberal globalization and the process led by the US is essentially a one-sided process that favors the highly developed countries under the leadership, well, as I just mentioned, of the US, but with China gaining growing presence and their multinational. And this is also controlled by the US multinational corporation. It is not a win-win-win process. For peripheral and emerging countries, and particularly for Mexico, the exportation of brain power implies an invaluable loss in terms of national development opportunities and potentialities. All the possibilities of developing a national innovation system is transferred, and the capacity of these scientists is transferred, basically to the US, but to many other countries throughout the world. Actually, high-skilled migration in the case of Mexico is more diverse than the broad migration. There are, for instance, in the Red Mexicana de Talentos, in extranjero, 27 chapters around the world. The other side of the coin is the increasing reliance and dependency on foreign brain power by OECD nations, and most importantly, in the case of the US. These questions, I think, the very notion of development, because a lot of the scientific capacity now is in the south for the service of the north, and not really, and in many ways we can say against the south. So it's a big challenge is how to transform this potentiality and at least recognize this important contribution. And finally, this scenario poses an important challenge for most emerging and peripheral countries to envisage a new institutional framework capable of taking advantage of the professional, scientific, and technological capabilities of their own brain power to promote alternative forms of human and sustainable development. And I just want to mention a few words regarding the Ecuadorian case. In Ecuador, they are promoting a new program. They have defined what are the key areas they need to develop in science and technology, according to their own reality. For instance, they try to tackle some of the diseases that are not of the interest of the multinational pharmaceutical corporations. They try to take advantage of the biodiversity of Ecuador in order to have a development alternative. So according to the definition of these main development areas in science and technology, what Ecuador has done is to have a very important program of scholarships for Ecuadorians to work in this area, to study in these areas abroad, and then return to the country in very good conditions. But they have another program, which I think is also very important. It's called Prometeo. And this program aims to attract scientists from all over the world in order to reinforce their national innovation systems. And the last point, I'm finishing, is that trying to be consistent with their migration policy, they are giving scholarships to Colombians that are immigrated to Ecuador in order to help them to improve their levels of qualification. Well, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Raúl. Thank you very much. And now it's my honor to introduce to you Leisy Abrego.
Good morning, everyone. I first really want to thank Lourdes Gouveia for inviting me and everyone who's been involved in taking care of so many details to make sure that we all have a great experience here. I definitely feel very welcomed. I'm going to talk to you today about things that we don't usually think of as being linked, U.S. immigration policies and how they might impact people who live outside of the U.S. We generally talk about immigration policy, at least in the public discourse, as being about protecting the nation and being about what happens within its borders and controlling all of that. But I want to show you that, in fact, these have very important repercussions in the lives and well-being of people way beyond U.S. borders. So I'm going to talk to you about the case of El Salvador, which is where I'm from, and tell you a little bit about remittances and how important these are there. I don't think this is the case only in El Salvador, but it's an important case to look at. Between the left and the right party there, they really don't have much that they can agree on, but one of the things that I found in this right-wing blog. Everything was about critiquing the left-wing party that is in power right now, except for family remittances. These were the good news under the current administration, and this was the image that they had on that blog. You see, you know, sun is shining, the sky is beautiful, and money is just falling from the sky, you know. And you know, people are just receiving it with open arms, and it's just this joyous, amazing, wonderful thing, right? So remittances are money that migrants earn and then send to people back in their home countries. Remittances are very, very important worldwide. In Latin America in 2012 alone, there were $64 billion sent in remittances. El Salvador got about almost $4 billion of that. And for a tiny country, it's a huge deal. It's something like 16% of its GDP. So there's so much money coming in. We have remittances exceeding the combined sum of foreign direct investment and official development assistance from around the world. And even during economic crises, it continues to be very reliable money. People continue to send remittances, perhaps a little bit less, but more so than these other sources that tended to be the more important sources. So there's this tendency to want to think of remittances as being great sources for development in the country. And the government, because they see that they don't have to invest in any way to get these remittances, consider this free money in a sense, right? So where do remittances come from? There are some, you know, hometown associations, and we see this throughout the world, and in the US definitely, where people get together with others from their hometown and have fundraisers, all sorts of different fundraisers to send money back to their towns for different projects. The vast majority of remittances, however, come from transnational families, where you have core members of families, the mother, the father, the children, living in two different countries. And in Latin America, in most of these cases, it's the parents who migrate to send to their young children. So it's important to note that for these remittances to happen, family separation has to happen. And that has consequences, even though we're thinking about these as just, you know, free money. Because of the very common experience of these transnational families, there are lots of myths that come about. We tend to talk about them in these ways, using these big figures, 64 billion, 4 billion, right? And so the assumption in all of that is that all families are benefiting equally. Because you hear that, many people who have access to just the regular, not critical information that we heard about earlier, the regular people are thinking, okay, migration is a guaranteed solution to poverty. And so it's the option that many people will want to take. And governments don't think of them critically because, again, they see them as being free funds. So in many ways, they're interested in making sure that people can make it to the US because they will be receiving these free funds, not necessarily by really stepping up and protecting their human rights in the process, but just to make sure that there aren't necessarily negative representations of migration. So the actual context in which all of this happens, however, really critically involves migration policies, and in these streams that end up in the US, the fact that the US provides very limited, it's almost impossible to get a visa in El Salvador and many other countries in Central America and in Mexico, what happens is that unauthorized travel ends up being the default way of getting to the US. And this is in a context of border militarization, an extremely dangerous process. In the case of Central Americans, it's also especially dangerous to go through the entire length of the Mexican territory without a visa and without any kind of human rights protections. So to avoid all of that, those adults who have children tend to leave them behind, creating these transnational families. And just to give you a little bit more of a visual sense of, the length of this process, this is El Salvador, small country, Central America. People travel across into Guatemala, and then the length of the Mexican territory is considered one of the most dangerous migration paths in the world. So we hear about 20,000 kidnappings per year. We hear about people losing their lives, losing limbs. Rape is almost a given. Women are taking birth control before they go on this journey because it's almost a given that they will be raped. Just extraordinary, horrific things that are happening to Central American migrants to get to the US. For those who are lucky enough to get to the US, the restrictions on acquisition of legal permanent residence are severe. We know right now, we're hearing all of these debates about immigration reform, and really there is no path for the majority of people coming in to be able to get legal permanent residency. So with little access to legalization, it means that these families the parents who just went through so much to get here, are not gonna take that risk to go back and visit their children. So the people that I talked to in my research have gone 10, 20 years without seeing each other. So how does all of this context then play into these families' well-being in the Americas? Let me just share a few stories of people that I spoke with. These are all pseudonyms, so not their real names. Mayra, who was a 16-year-old in El Salvador, who is the daughter of a migrant father who has legal permanent residency. And so Mayra, you'll see, is doing very well. And this is the kind of discourse that we hear about transnational families most often. She says, my father sends us $500 for the three of us, for her and her two brothers. He sends my grandparents money separately for all the other expenses. I spend it all on my things like shampoo, lotion, tuition. My brother's in the university, so we pay for that and for books and everything that we use in school, uniforms, shoes. This year I've already bought 3 pairs of shoes just for school. So Mayra, when I went to her school to try to find people to interview, all the teachers said, you need to talk to her. She's always wearing these fancy clothes, and she's definitely the representation of those transnational families, right? And so everyone notices these people who are doing very, very well, and so they want to really capitalize on those funds that are coming in, because someone like her seems to be spending them on things that are not absolutely necessary. So we should use it for development instead, and that's what a lot of the policies get based on. Here's the case of Daniel in another school, in a public school in a very poor sector of San Salvador. And his father migrated to the US. It took him 3 attempts to finally get in. He was undocumented. And he certainly was not doing so well. He said, it has been 3 or 4 months that my father hasn't worked. He wants to send us money. He used to send us whatever he could, but he only sends letters now. It's just been such bad luck. Look, there are days, that's why I'm going to church now, because there are days when I just want to climb up to the roof and I want to hang myself. Because when I see so much that is happening to us, the situation is really terrible. I just start to think, I say, man, if they take the house, what's going to happen? What will happen if we have to live on the streets? And so I actually found a lot of people in San Salvador in these situations. His father, who was undocumented, the only job he could get, which is often the case for undocumented men, was heavy physical labor where he was not trained, he hurt his back, and once you've hurt yourself and you don't have access to medical care, then you have very few options for any kind of work that will provide for both you and your family abroad, right? So he hurt his back and has not been able to work and has not been able to send money to the family. Meanwhile, at the time when he migrated, it was a $6,000 expense to try to get into the US. Even though he failed the first time, he still had that debt. And so for someone who is not earning any money, He was the main earner in their family there. The situation has been exacerbated further and further and further. And the fact that he's undocumented is not going to allow him to gain access to any kind of stable employment. So these are the stories that we don't hear as often, but are also common in these situations. So legal status affects the economic well-being of families there because it determines what kinds of jobs people have access to, how much they're gonna earn, whether those jobs are stable or not, what kinds of conditions they're gonna be in, and it also really determines what kind of flexibility people have in negotiating within their job or for better jobs. So I talked to people who were documented and undocumented, and the differences are very stark in terms of what they ask for and what kinds of benefits they have and that kind of thing. Emotionally, there are also linkages that are very important. This is the case of Doris, whose mother is a legal permanent resident, and they had been apart for about 5 years when I met her. She said her mother came to visit the previous year. She says, when she came, it was all happiness. When we picked her up at the airport, she didn't recognize us, walked right past us to hug her sisters and asked them, where are my kids? And they said, behind you. And she hugged us and she wouldn't let go. It was really nice. We spent the entire month with her. Everything was wonderful. I think that just because she left, that didn't take her love away from us. It's just that she couldn't hug us from a distance. And so the fact that her mom had legal permanent residency and could travel, even if it was only once every 5 years, once every 3 years, made such a difference to the way that the children in these families cope with that separation. As painful as it is, the fact that they can see their parent every once in a while makes this bearable. This is Lucia, on the other hand. Her mother left when she was just a very young child, and her mother's undocumented, so she can't visit. And so things have not improved economically for her, and she's in a very difficult situation. And when I ask her, what is the toughest thing about being in this kind of family, her response, after she thinks about it for a while, she says, when I was little, I would hear people say that McDonald's was American food, so whenever we went downtown by that McDonald's, I would try to peer inside, just look inside the window for as long as I could to see if I could see my mother there. And she's crying. Yes, my life has been pure suffering without her. One never really understands why a mother would abandon you, why she would leave you if nothing changes. Nothing is better, everything is worse. And it wasn't that Lucia's mother was not remitting. She was remitting, but it was only about $40, $50 a month, which was all she could afford based on the kinds of jobs that she has access to. But when you are growing up and you don't see any improvement in your life economically and your parent does not come and visit, imagine how difficult emotionally that is, right? And it's not that her mother would not want to go visit her, it's that she can't because she's undocumented. So the emotional part of this is based on the fact that you don't see any economic improvement. You can't point to any concrete gains for this kind of family strategy. You also go for very long periods of time without seeing each other, and that's very painful, especially when there's no certainty about when families are going to be able to reunite. If you have legal permanent residency or if you're a US citizen, you can apply to bring your family. And so even if it takes 10 years, which is often the case, you have at least a sense in your mind that at some point legally you will be able to live together again, and that provides some hope. But when you have an undocumented parent who can't do that for you, there's no sense of when or if that's ever going to happen, and that is also a very distressful experience to be in. So the myths about migration development, are that migration is this guaranteed solution to poverty. But I want to convince you that immigration policies stand in the way of that as real obstacles. We talk about remittances as if all families benefit equally, but the reality is that given these structural limitations on migrants, the results are going to be stratified, and not everyone is going to do well. In fact, most people only do so-so. in the Salvadoran case. And then the idea that remittances are free might be true for governments that don't have to spend money on human development for this population and then just get to receive money back. But it's definitely costly for the migrants who may lose their lives or their limbs or just their human dignity in the process of getting to the U.S. And then once they're in the U.S., they're really just at the exploited tremendously in their jobs and by people in this society. So I want us to think more critically about what remittances are and how they affect people throughout the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Leisy. And I was very glad that you included some of those examples, because those are the cases that we work with every day, and it really is a reminder of these conversations that we're having. They do have a serious, significant impact in people's lives. And so it's easy to sometimes categorize a group of people, and when you hear the social media or people talking in the streets about immigrants, they're somebody's children, they're parents, they're brothers and sisters. And by the way, Leisy, 10 years would be a great case scenario if you have to wait for 10 years to bring a relative. Sometimes it's more than twice that long. So even with the very few lines that our current immigration legal system provides, the wait within those few lines is extremely long, and therefore there's really not a line for people to stand on for people that have heard that said on the public. Why can't somebody just stand in line? Well, there is not a line. And if you can come up with a line, let me tell you, that wait is going to be, sometimes exceeds life expectancy. So knowing that our current immigration legal system doesn't work, and knowing that we are working and that there is that discourse, currently there is a lot of conversation going on at the national level about immigration reform. I'd just like to start by asking a question from our friends in South America, and I think Leisy shares some of those thoughts with us, where some of those problems are. But what would you, from your perspective, suggest the policymakers in this country keep in mind as we're having that conversation?
React to that? Well, sorry. In fact, remittances are not a very important factor in South America, and in that respect, as there are other many changes in between South America and North America, remittances are. South America is not a great receiver of remittances, and also in the countries that receive a large amount of remittances, like Brazil, for instance, or Argentina is not a large receiver. They represent a very small percentage of the GDP. So it's interesting to notice that, with the exception of Colombia and Ecuador, who have suffered what I would say almost massive emigration in the last decade, there are no big programs on remittances in the rest of the countries, and that remittances is not a big issue in terms of migration policies, which is one of the reasons I didn't include it in my presentation. But in terms of general conclusions, I would say that remittances are not considered. In fact, the Latin America, the South American government has expressly declared in one of the declarations of the South American Conference that remittances should not be seen, like the myth indicates, as one of the solutions in terms of migrants or migration cooperation to development. That the contribution made by remittances is largely overshadowed by the fact of the loss that those immigrants represent, both in terms of potential labor or skilled labor, but mainly in terms of the impact, the social impact of the families left behind.
Well, you said South America. Well, I'm talking about Mexico, which is North America. We did a study. I will talk a little about remittances just to complement what you said brilliantly. We did an estimation of what was the cost of remittances for Mexico, and compared that to the accumulated amount in the NAFTA era of remittances that Mexico received. And just considering, it was a very subestimated estimation in many ways. We consider just the level of education where they arrived for the first time to the U.S. From 1994 to 2012. And we consider also the cost, the reproduction cost of the labor, just considering what they need to, with what we call canasta básica, what they need to just to survive at the age they arrive for the first time to the U.S. And the overall result is that the cost for Mexico more than doubles the accumulated amount of remittances. So in reality, it's a South-North subsidy and not the other way around, as it is always thought. And of course, remittances partly solve a problem in Mexico, but it's basically not for the families that receive the remittances, but basically of the cuenta, ¿cómo se? Balance, exchange rate. Exchange rate. And well, regarding your question, which I think is very fundamental. Well, first of all, the migration reform bill that didn't pass so far departs from false assumptions. Departs from one assumption that is that undocumented migrants don't pay taxes, and they pay they have paid a lot of taxes, and they don't receive social benefits in most occasions. No? So that's one important issue. Secondly, if you apply, you cannot be poor. That is one condition. And as you know, 54 of the Mexican immigrants are undocumented, more or less. No? We're talking between 6 and 7 million immigrants, but half of them are poor. So they are not able to apply for the reform. And then they will be 10 years paying what if they are allowed to be in this process, at least to go out of the shadows. They will have to, in 10 years, return the taxes that they already paid, and not receive any social benefits in that period. They may apply if they behave well in 13 years for the citizenship. So I don't think that is a good thing. But also I think it's very important that they are considering the number of visas the quota of visas, which is totally, it does not consider the needs of the labor market in the U.S. It's totally away from the needs. No, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think they were like 150,000. Well, more or less. Yeah, but half of them for high-skilled migrants. And the problem is that normally I think there is a need of nearly 1 million migrants. And sometimes Mexico there were like 600,000 migrants. Now that this is the lowest level of Mexican migration, what they call zero migration, with a lot of deportations. There are 300,000 Mexican migrants to the U.S. No? So half of what they will be allowed, so half will become undocumented. But going beyond that, what really, if you really want to solve the problem, you have to tackle the root causes. Right. And that is not going to tackle the root causes, and so we have to face the asymmetries and the growing asymmetries among countries, and only not free trade agreements, but cooperation for development should be a basic solution, and that could be a fair integration process that what I think is hopefully being thought in the South American region.
Thank you, Raúl. Leisy, do you want to make any comments, or you want to take some questions? Okay. Questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to say that your use of the oral history interviews was really powerful, Leisy. And I had one question about, it seemed like most of the evidence you presented was children talking about not having their mothers. And so I wondered if you could say more about, did you examine differences between having a mother or a father gone, or how did you approach that issue?
Thank you. So this is from my book project that is based on 130 interviews with about 83 children of migrants in El Salvador and mothers and fathers in LA. And I do an analysis based on gender differences of the parent who migrated, as well as legal status differences based on the parent that migrated, and just look at how those play out. Did you have any specific question about the differences? So, well, it's not out yet. The book will be out in a couple of months. But the differences that stood out the most to me were that I expected to see that even though women earn a lot less than men in the kinds of jobs that are available to women, I expected that their families would be faring very poorly financially, and that was not always the case. There were many families doing very well financially and getting consistent remittances. So I tried to figure that out, and it was just that women are really sacrificing a lot, sending greater proportions of their earnings and staying with very little behind. So in terms of integration in the US, among these parents, the women are really not involved in much because they have nothing left to spend on anything other than the very basics. And in terms of legal status, it was pretty much what you'd expect, where people whose parents are undocumented are faring worse financially and emotionally. Emotionally, in terms of gender, the children, even when they're doing very well financially, because we're told over and over in everything around us that mothers are unique and mothers are especially important for daily care, because all of the burden of that care usually goes to mothers, then the children definitely felt their absence in a very, very distressful way for them.
Any other questions? The gentleman in the back.
The best way to make a bad job better is to level the playing field in the workplace and allow everyday wage earners to have a meaningful voice in determining their future quality of life. That's not just true in the US, that's true in every nation on earth. The labor movement in the United States is slowly waking up. Since 1980, the AFL-CIO has had a progressive policy on economic migrants who've come to this country, and they're organizing the work being done in Los Angeles with the Labor Center there. Kent Wong's work is spectacular. How are unions viewed in those nations where economic migrants are coming from to the United States? Lord knows our labor laws here stink and should get better, but what are labor laws like in the countries that are sending folks here?
Well, the International Network on Migration and Development is a member of the Global Coalition on Migration, which gathers most of the global networks of migrants, but also some of the most important unions throughout the world, and Via Campesina. And there is, I think, a growing consciousness among workers and laborers and unions regarding that they are no longer seeing immigrants as their enemies. They are looking broader and seeing this corporate strategy. Like in the case of the US in particular, this sending parts of the productive processes in search of low wages abroad, what is called global labor arbitrage, is one of the main sources of the restructuring of the industrial sector in the US, but also replacing labor in the industrial sector by cheaper labor abroad. So the main architect of this policy are the large corporations. And this is something that unions and migrants are realizing and trying to change.
Make another comment, and that is that on the one hand, many new investments in South America are tied with agreements with multinational corporations, mainly linked to mining, building of new ports or bridges, dams. And many of these companies, at the same time, they have other companies to build, especially when they are infrastructure processes, to build the special parts, and they bring in foreign workers. So this has changed the nature of the problem, because for instance, it happened in Uruguay and it happened in Argentina. Labor movement has said, well, I mean, first of all, we have to make sure that the Malaysians or Turks you're bringing in for building this or that are paid accordingly to national laws. And secondly, or first, because that's the first issue, first we have to make sure that you're not replacing nationals or deplacing nationals by foreign workers, be it skilled or non-skilled. And second, that they are paid in any case according to national standards. So this is one aspect of the labor migration problem nowadays that is getting increasingly important. But I would say that the labor movement in many countries has also changed its perception about foreign labor migration, because one of the changes in the last decade also was that unions have weakened, when not disappeared. So these immigrants, especially if they come to stay, we are talking about permanent immigration, they are going to become part of the same unions, and therefore will strengthen them in the mid or short or longer term.
Any other questions? Lisette. Oh, there's two more. Okay. We'll start right here.
I have a question for Juan Artola, and I was wondering if you can quote evidence from the experience of, of these kind of policies within South American countries, where they are not distinguishing or they are trying as best as they can as a policy that doesn't differentiate much the rights of somebody that is a national citizen and an immigrant. If there are positive impacts in terms of social mobility and assimilation of these current migrants, for instance, in Argentina, Bolivians, things like that.
I think it's still very early to say, because immigration or migration in general in South America has changed a lot, and also it's quite different from Mexico and Central America. And I think one of the presentations of the earlier panel showed it, that Central American and Mexicans tend to go basically to the US and some to Canada, while in South America the movements are to the States, but also in great quantities, and especially in the last 10 years to Europe. And also the difference of return, because return to Central America is more linked to deportation. And in South America we have a lot of some deportation, but basically voluntary return, or forced voluntary because forced, because the conditions of labor, wages, etc. in Europe and basically in Spain have changed. Up to now, Argentina has been the main attractor of immigrants, with over 1.2 immigrants received and turned residents in the last decade. But it happens now that many other countries in South America are becoming more countries of immigration rather than emigration, and so Chile is receiving and is willing to receive more immigrants, and the same happens with Brazil, which is beginning to define an immigration policy, and the same happens with other countries. But it's important, like a giant country like Brazil is, for the first time, not just willing, but also interested, promoting the reception of immigrants, because they realize that the labor force, the Brazilian labor force, needs immigration. In the case of Brazil, it's more complex, because Brazil needs hundreds of thousands of qualified immigrants, and even professionals and technicians. So it's going to become in the coming years a very important attractor of immigration. Uruguay needs immigrants, but in a very short scale. Chile needs immigrants, but they would prefer them to be, well, fair-skinned and quiet in general, so they are not looking, or they're putting more reservations to neighbor countries, and they will stop doing that when they realize that white immigrants are not going to work in plantations and in the agriculture, which is what Chile needs. Let's say that Argentina, which is the country who has the largest experience in immigration, I think the quality of migrant integration is in general very good, because also not just the migration law, but also other laws establishes that education and health are free for all, and therefore any immigrant, whether he has papers or not, can be rejected in a hospital or in a school. And also because Argentina has put in place some deliberate measures and regulations and program to integrate immigrants. So I guess in Argentina it's working very well. In Uruguay, where immigration is new, and in Chile, where immigration is not totally new but unknown, it's not going to be that easy, even the amounts are going to be smaller, because both Uruguay and Chile are very conservative countries. And although the official talk about immigration is very positive, I would say that there are differences between official policy and national sensitivity. So the question of discrimination and abuse is very much linked to information and sensitization and education in general of society.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and I saw a hand raised here, but there's another one there. So if we can keep the answers relatively short, we may be able to get both of the questions in. I think she raised her. Sorry, right there.
Perhaps they can do the two questions and then.
Oh yeah, why don't we take the two questions? So we'll take your question and then your question, and then we'll let them respond. And yeah.
Okay, so my question is for Raúl. It's clear that the brain drain is bad for the sending country, but maybe it's good for Latinos in the U.S. if Latino immigrants have their image reshaped by the arrival of more technical and skilled immigrants. Then maybe the perception of all Latino immigrants as unskilled would be changed, and that would improve the situation for those already here. So I was wondering what you think about that.
There's no domestic workforce in the United States that's willing to take on sheep herder industry, to work as sheep herders. So what's happening is there's some 680 sheep herders in Colorado being brought in from Peru and Chile and Mexico, and they're serving as indentured servants. They're being paid, they're exempt from national employment law, they're exempt from housing law. They're being paid 99 cents an hour. They live in solitude. They say that they've never experienced true starvation in their country until they come to the United States. And so what can we be doing to stop this intergovernment agreement to exploit this population of workers?
Okay. Well, there was a direct question to me. I think that the basic problem is not that there is not enough skilled migration. I just gave some figures of highly qualified skilled migration, which is very, very important for the U.S. And there, for us now, and we are starting to study that, it's like a black box. We don't know exactly in what areas Mexicans are leading scientists, no, in the U.S., but we know that they are, and there is a huge amount. I was talking about 1.1 million Mexican born and 2.5 million of Mexican origin. The five top immigrants, highly qualified immigrants, are from the global south in the U.S., and they are requiring a lot. Like half of the investments in Silicon Valley come from entrepreneurs from the south. So the problem is that this is not disseminating, and public opinion is not aware of these facts. But also, this is not the only fact. You can see the contribution. We have done some a lot of research on this area and see the contributions to the growth of the GDP of the U.S. And immigrants contribute like 30% in the last decade to the growth of the GDP in the U.S. And they provided more than half of the labor needed in the U.S. So, and then they also pay taxes and don't receive social benefits or receive less than what they should, etc. So we can continue, no, with this, but the problem is that I think this, yes, I know. So I think the important thing is that to make this available, and just to short response to your question, I don't think it would be useful that to open the door so that to continue, no, this trend, no, because this is not going to solve, and it's going to deepen the problem because the asymmetries among the countries are going to grow. And regarding that, the other question, there is a recently approved ILO convention regarding domestic work. And it has to be, I think, I don't know if it has been ratified by the US, but if it's ratified, then at least that's a way to go on, you know, with this.
Can I just say very briefly, I think there's also an entire context of colonization and racialization and criminalization of Latino immigrants in the US that is not going to be erased with a few 100,000 PhDs. I mean, how many of us are Latino PhDs in this room? And I can assure you that we've had lots of experiences of being assumed to be, nannies, and I know I've had many of those experiences with my own kids at the park. So it takes a whole lot more, I think, to change those kinds of perceptions. And then as far as the situation, thank you for sharing. I've never heard of this situation, but I'm thinking that maybe local unions or organizations can bring attention to that and bring media to it and get people talking about it to improve the conditions there.
Thank you, Leisy. And I'd like to remind everybody that we have Pedro Noguera, the keynote speaker, at the lunch, which will be at the Milo Bale Student Center. And thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel.